Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Percy. I'm the Dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Ernie Bonner Equity Forum. This is an annual event we have every year. We have a wonderful speaker for you tonight. We're going to have a lot of fun. I wanted to express our thanks and to acknowledge members of the Bonner family who are here tonight. We've had lunch together earlier, and I'll tell you about something exciting that happened there, but we have Lynn Bonner, Ernie's wife. We have Brian Bonner, and who was Ernie's brother, and Brian's partner, Ashley Ferry, and Christine Bonner, Ernie's daughter, and Christine's partner, Lee McKnight, are all here. Thank you and welcome. We had all fun today because we started at lunch today where we had a great opportunity to recognize 2 scholarship recipients who have been very fortunate to receive funding through scholarships as provided by the family. And we talked to our recipients, one of whom was Tabitha Baschetti, who's in our Master's of Urban and Regional Planning, and a second recipient is Austin Cummings, who's in our Doctoral Urban Studies program. So we had a lovely chance to talk to the young people that are benefiting from the scholarships. And so we have a very exciting night to you. We're going to let you hear a little bit more about Ernie Bonner in just a second from my colleague, but I want to personally, on my own behalf and on behalf of everyone in our college, our faculty, staff, and students, thank all the members of the Bonner family for a chance to celebrate the legacy of a wonderful family member and the support you've given to our program and to our students. So thank you very much. I'd like to introduce, thank you. I'd like to introduce Connie, who is the director of the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning, known to almost all of you, I think.
Thank you, Steve. So some of you may be wondering, who is Ernie Bonner? Well, for those of us who are recent arrivals to the city of Portland, we might first have met Ernie Bonner as the chief planner in Cleveland, Ohio, when he served under the first African-American mayor in one of the 10 largest cities in the country at that time, Cleveland, Ohio. And Ernie Bonner worked with Norm Krumholtz, and they made waves in that city, much of which is documented in a book called Making Equity Planning Work, Leadership in the Public Sector. It's a bunch of case studies. It was a book that inspired many generations of planners. Well, probably 2, I don't know. Do demographers count generations as 20 years? The book was published in 1990. But anyway, has inspired many, many planners, was used as a required text in many MERP, Masters of Urban and Regional Planning programs across the country, including ours. And so 541, and you would have had to read it, and you should read it now anyway, although we don't require it anymore. But it is, the book describes how the Bonner-Krumholtz team fought to defend the public welfare while also helping the city's poorest citizens. For those of you who were living in Portland in the 1970s and 80s, you may be more familiar with Ernie Bonner's work than those of us who are more recent immigrants to the city. But all of us today benefit extremely from his work. Ernie Bonner left Cleveland for Portland in 1973. He was recruited to be the chief planning director here, and he served until 1978. In those 5 short years, he's credited with setting in motion the city's remarkable downtown renaissance through implementation of the 1972 downtown plan, through the creation of the Tom McCall Waterfront Park, and through the construction of Pioneer Courthouse Plaza. And so those are all kind of linchpins for the city today, much to his credit. Ernie's involvement in the public affairs of our region continued through his tenure at Metro, as an energy conservation manager for the Bonneville Power Administration, and importantly, as a citizen activist and volunteer in many civic organizations. He advocated for many issues, including moving the East Bank Freeway, connecting the North-South Park blocks, and drawing attention to the city's shortage of affordable housing. In short, as one reporter wrote, Ernie Bonner was, quote, a monumentally important figure in Portland's history. The College of Urban and Public Affairs here recognized Ernie's contribution by awarding him the Urban Pioneer Award in 2003. In accepting this award, he said to Portland and to Portlanders, this is Ernie speaking, I hope our justifiable pride in this city does not blind us to the need for new efforts, new accomplishments. Some of us, I should say some of you, are still young enough to get up early in the morning, and we will need such special efforts from you. But all of us surely agree that this city in 30 years will be no more and no less than the results of what we are working on today. Great places don't just happen, right? Equity just doesn't emerge. Ernie Bonner's working definition of equity was simply creating more choices for those who have the fewest, the very operational, inspirational definition. It is truly an honor for the Toulon School to host the Ernie Bonner Equity Forum and to host the Ernie Bonner Equity Planning Endowed Scholarship that our dean spoke of earlier. It's our honor to continue the relationship with Ernie's family, who are as civically oriented and active as Ernie, particularly by affording to us the opportunity to keep alive and to push harder on these equity issues that he so deeply cared about. So I also want to thank the Bonner family, and especially Brian, for making this Equity Forum series possible, because it is really with your continuing support to us as a separate kind of effort, activity, and Brian has come to us with ideas every year for stimulating speakers, topics that we should be dealing with in our city, and we deeply appreciate it. So thank you, Brian, and thank you, Bonner family. So I promised our speaker tonight that I would keep this short, and I don't know that I have, but I would like to invite now Greg Schrock, professor in our department, to introduce their speaker.
All right. Good evening. It is my great pleasure, and I mean that truly, to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Dr. Anne Markusen. Anne is Professor Emerita of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where she directs the Arts Economy Initiative and the Project on Regional and Industrial Economics, and is principal of Markusen Economic Research Services. Her career has taken her from Michigan, where she completed her doctorate in economics at Michigan State University, to faculty positions in economics at Colorado University, and in urban planning at University of California, Northwestern University, Rutgers, and finally Minnesota, where I had the great fortune of studying and working with her during and since my time as a master's student in urban planning there. I could probably spend the entire evening talking about all the amazing work that she's done, but I just want to say, I mean, she's won numerous awards over the years for her scholarship, which has ranged from studying energy boom towns in the West to the growth of high tech and the restructuring of manufacturing industries, defense conversion in the military industrial complex, to the role of arts and culture in economic development, which she will be talking about tonight. Although she officially retired from the University of Minnesota faculty a few years ago, Dr. Markusen has been incredibly active in her research and consulting work for policymakers and practitioners on the cultural economy throughout the US and internationally. Over this time, she has become arguably the leading thinker on this topic, focusing not just on the possibilities of arts and culture to contribute to local economic vitality and growth, but also toward more distinctive and inclusive communities, which speaks to her values as a planning scholar. In 2010, she and Anne Gadwa and Nicodemus co-authored a highly influential report for the National Endowment for the Arts entitled Creative Placemaking, about which she will be talking about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Anne Markusen.
Greg was an amazing, amazing person to work with, and we're still writing a paper together, aren't we? Okay. My fault. I'm the low person here. So I prefer to really stand out here and work. And if anybody would really like to relocate farther north to the front, you'll see the great photos that I have a lot better. I'm going to start by talking about how I got involved in this creative placemaking study. I had been working for 5 or 6 or 7 years on artists mainly, and on approaching economic development by studying occupations, not just industries. And just kind of by accident, I chose artists as a first occupation to really study because they were overrepresented in the backyard of my hometown, Minneapolis-St. Paul, where I'd moved back to. And over the years, I became, I did a lot of really interesting work and met a lot of interesting people. And in 2009, President Obama appointed this man, Rocco Landesman, who's a Broadway producer from the commercial sector, owns 4 theaters on Broadway, and brought some of the edgiest work on Broadway to America, including Angels in America. And he asked Rocco to be his head of the National Endowment for the Arts, and Rocco was thrilled to be invited to serve. And he chose as his deputy this wonderful woman, Joan Shigakawa, who was the longtime arts program director at the Rockefeller Foundation. And one thing I like to point out about these two is that before they hooked up, even though they lived and worked within 20 blocks of each other in New York City, they had never met each other. And this is about the kind of siloing of the commercial and nonprofit sectors in general, but particularly in arts and culture. So in the summer of 2009, Joan called me and asked me if I would come to Washington and have dinner with her and Rocco Landesman. And I was really thrilled to be invited. And she said, we'd like to pitch a project to you. So I came, and they sort of explained their situation. You know that the National Endowment for the Arts was almost zeroed out in the 1990s by the 1994 Congress. Mainly because of the culture wars, which was really about AIDS. It was really about the AIDS crisis and a number of artists acting out about how outrageous it was. And it struggled along for a number of years. So when Rocco arrived, he looked at his budget and he wept. It was so small compared to what he was used to managing. And he immediately began to do 2 extraordinary things. For one, he said, well, I'm really like the Secretary of Culture. I'm going to go call on the secretaries of Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, the Environmental Protection, Energy, Department of Defense, Labor, and I'm going to pitch to them how arts and culture helps them serve their mission. And he got these, pretty interesting responses, and he managed to, show certain ways that that arts and culture could be worked into their programs, and that there could be some funding then for artists and arts organizations. And you'll see a little bit of that later. The other thing he did was to admit that he had really never been outside New York City. And he started to tour the rest of the country, like 1 week, every month he would spend 1 week touring around. And he made some big mistakes at first. One was that he went to Chicago, and he said in a really public thing covered by journalists, Chicago is, you've got the Lyric Opera, you've got the Art Institute, you're not like Peoria. Well, the next day, the people in Peoria called and said, yeah, excuse us, you think you have to get down here. So he went. What he did on this tour was amazing. Before he went, he knocked on the doors of all the arts and cultural leaders and said, come with me, we're going to see the mayor, we're going to tell him what you do for the city. With his presence, he brought out the journalists, and so he really made a big show in all of these different places, and that really helped a lot kind of make the ground fertile for this initiative that he had. And he went to many smaller places as well. And I think this ambassadorship was a really important role that he played. So they asked me if I would write a framing white paper for this new initiative called Our Town that they were going to fund. So with his paltry budget, he was going to take some amount of funding and devote it. By the way, Joan had funded some of the first really, really interesting community arts work that had been done in the country by foundations who were sort of beginning to just break away from their just funding the really big, large fine arts organizations. And he kind of had started this process. I forgot where I was going with that point. Anyway, so they asked me if I would write this framing piece. And I said, okay, I'm going to go talk to my collaborator, Anne. We put our heads together, and I called back and I said, we can do this, but we have to do some research. We can't just write this off the top of our heads. You know, it's a really challenging thing. And they said, okay, fine, but you have to do it in 5 months because we'd like the first draft in 5 months. And you have to cover every kind of city, like older industrial cities and newer suburban cities and small towns. You have to cover every arts discipline, music, performing arts and theater, visual arts, design, and you have to cover all kinds of, you know, different missions, and you have to have diversity and everything else. I said, okay, we'll do the best we can. What we pitched to them was that we would do a scan across the United States. We would do it all by phone, which we did. I felt that I already had a lot of connections and that you could build more connections. It was like a little networking effort. And we identified a huge matrix of potential case studies that were more or less completed, where people had done what they wanted to do with their Outtown program on their own, just in different places. And we ended up with about, I don't know, several hundred to choose from. And in the end, we chose just 15 case studies that pretty much covered this bill. And out of that, we drew the ingredients of, you know, what I will present to you, what we saw as really the challenges, et cetera. So we defined creative placemaking this way. Joan was a wonderful client. We really worked back and forth with her on this. Creative placemaking is when partners from public, private, nonprofit, community, and sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, reservation, city, or region with arts and cultural activity at the core. And we really stressed that it wasn't just arts as an instrument. It was also about the practice of arts and culture per se as well. So these were the ingredients that we pulled out of our case study. And I still love to debate these. And I just made a date today, actually, to interview Joan and Rocco in New York in a few weeks to do a kind of retrospective with them, because they're both back in, you know, out of the NEA. And the first is really, every single case was prompted by an initiator with vision and drive. And almost always it was one individual. And one day Joan called me and said, I can't believe how many of these initiators were artists. And I said, yeah, it blew my mind too, but it's really the case, you know, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. Almost all of these cases were tailored to some distinctive feature of place. So they weren't about, oh, they have a performing arts center over there, we need one. No, they built on something about their own local culture or their own physical infrastructure existing that they had, and they built around that to really sort of say something really powerful about their community. All of them had to mobilize public will, and that meant getting either one person on the city council or the mayor to be excited. And you probably know that arts and culture is not the highest thing on any mayor's, you know, list. If you go listen to the state of the city addresses of most mayors, it's really not on there. So that was a big challenge, but also just getting the public at large excited about the project that was happening, especially in the area if you were doing it in just part of a city. All of them had to attract private sector buy-in. Often they needed development finance, even if they were renovating a building rather than building one. And they needed bridge financing from banks. They needed expertise from the private sector. All of them needed the support of local arts and cultural leaders. And this was often one of the hardest things to get because the existing foundations and arts and cultural organizations were all tied into what they were already into. And they all felt beleaguered and that there wasn't enough money and they had their own agendas. They weren't that excited about the invitation to walk out their doors and do something for their community. And they had to also build partnerships across sectors, commercial, nonprofit, public sector and community, across mission areas. As Rocco was doing in Washington, he wanted to see the same thing locally, to really partner across mission areas. Art and healthcare, art and transportation, art and community development, and so on, and across levels of government. And you'll really see that in the next example. So I'm going to give you this Cleveland, Ohio example because I think it's really a really great encapsulator of this creative placemaking process and has been very successful even since we wrote about the piece. So this is Detroit's Shoreway, the west side of Cleveland in the 1930s. And you can see here, it was prosperous, working class community, nice automobiles. This is the Capitol Film Theater, which was a community institution at the time. By the 1990s, it looked like this. and notice the police cars in the foreground. And this young man in the middle, a musician, decided that he wanted to save and reopen the Capitol Film Theater. He bought the theater, and for the next 7 years, all he could do was keep the roof from leaking, and he had a really hard time, figuring out who would finance it, who would help him do this. He found there were 2 other theater groups in his neighborhood who were also really interested in doing this. One of them was a live theater company that owned a theater across the street that was also structurally sound, but needed a lot of renovation work. They weren't using it. And there was a youth theater performing in the upstairs of a church. So they got together and they decided what they wanted was a Gordon Square, that was the name of the neighborhood, theater district. And they began to try to raise money for that, but they needed a partner who really knew something about development. And who did they find but a community development corporation that had been successfully developing low-income housing for 30 years. I'm sure actually Ernie Bonner knew about this group, and I also was just so thrilled to really hear about him because Norm Krumholtz was a hero to me. But at any rate, they teamed up together because the Community Development Corporation had this expertise about how to do development. They were still having trouble raising money for it, especially because the big foundations and it's just hard to tap in. So they came upon the idea of doing a streetscape. They thought it would be a marker because the Community Development Corporation was really interested in some commercial revitalization. All the housing they developed were great, but it hadn't really made a dent on this commercial strip that I showed you a few minutes ago. So they decided to go for that first, and then they would go for the theater renovation money. So this is the amounts of money they raised from different sources over the course of 10 to 12 years. And I think it's a really interesting illustration of all the different partners they had to develop and the stages they went through, and even not the large amounts of money, but just how hard it was to get it together. So first, they just had to really work hard to get enough money to do the feasibility study for the streetscape, which they got from LISC and from their city council member, because they had a district city council, freed up a little community development block grants for them. And then it took them another 5 years, really, to raise the money for and build the streetscape, which they got from, again, the city of Cleveland, the Northeast Ohio, the Transit Authority, Cleveland Public, all public sector, but a lot of different organizations to have to deal with an approach. And then finally, it took them, and by the way, this is what the streetscape looks like and looked like when they finished it, before they finished the renovations. These pictures are all at least 5 years old now, so I just want to also say that. So then the theater renovations were really the hardest part. So far they've spent about $4 million, but this part was a big, another $10 million they had to raise. And again, mostly they first got it from the capital grants from the state, from the county, from the city, and then finally the big Cleveland foundations came in. Why hadn't they come in before? Because they were locked in to the Symphony and the Art Institute on the east side, the prosperous side of Cleveland, and they were, their door was closed for a long time. But when they saw the success of this partnership in getting the money together, they were really very excited. And then they also raised a lot of money from philanthropic contributions from individuals, both wealthy and ordinary working class people in their neighborhood. And finally, when the Obama administration came in, they did get some new market tax credits, and also they tapped into historical preservation tax credits and so on. So that's kind of how they put the whole story together. So this is what the Capitol Film Theater looked like when they were done. This is the youth theater performing on the proscenium stage of the Capitol Film Theater. This is the Cleveland Public Theater with people streaming through the door, and this is their summer youth group performing on their stage. And now the new theater for the youth group is just about finished. So I think this is just a wonderful example of the partnering, the difficulty in raising money from different levels of government and the success of it. And Dennis Keating, who was a protege of Norm Krumholtz, has just, and is a planning professor at Cleveland State, just wrote this wonderful update on the Gordon Square Arts District, which is full of a lot of details of, that sort of update for what we did in 2010. And you can get it on their faculty website. So I want to also say that we have a Portland case study, and I'm nervous about showing this because you may probably know a whole lot more about how successful this case was or not, but I don't even know if you know about the history of this. But this was Portland was the first place to really build a new light rail system, and a staff member in the TriMet was really, concerned about ridership. Everybody was concerned about ridership. Would people ride it? You're kind of a low density, car-oriented city. Would it really work? And he got this great idea, the staff guy. Well, maybe we could, hire artists to design stations and have the artists do a consultation with the community and ask them what they would really like each station to say about their community. And that would really increase ridership, and it would not just for people in the community, but other people would like to come and see what these stations look like. And he went, of course, the engineers immediately said, no, we don't spend money on that, we're not doing that. The guy went all the way to the Department of Transportation in Washington, which is a very rich agency, especially in that period of time, and convinced them that this was a worthwhile thing to do. And they said, Department of Transportation, sure, we'll fund this. We'd be glad to do this. It sounds like we're worried about ridership too. So in the end, this is what they did. And I'm just going to show you here an example. This is at the, what is it called here? You probably know this, but the Portland Metropolitan Exposition Center. So in this case, the artist consulted with the community about what they wanted, and there was a large Japanese-American community, and they said, we want the station to tell the story of our incarceration in the desert during World War II. And so the artist said, okay, bring me things, artifacts of your time in the desert, I will make you this thing, yes?
So this is the albino station and not the expo.
Oh, it is? Oh, maybe I'm mixing the two of them up. Oh, this is, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, but here's the picture that's from, sorry. So I didn't do this case study, and we did all of it by the phone, and they supplied the pictures. But here's the case study from the exposition center. So, and I love this picture because this is on opening day, and this actually hasn't been, set into the wall yet. But it's a reproduction of the newspaper for the time, and it says, "Alien ouster urged now." And here this woman is reading the newspapers and revisiting, this expression of what the period of time really was like for them. So, and here's, what Valerie Otani, who designed it, said. This is, memorializes 3,700 Japanese Americans interned during World War II at the Portland Metropolitan Exposition Center site. And it goes on to explain a lot of it, what is going on. So, and I don't really know how people in Portland, how much you know about this, how you feel about the different stations. Los Angeles followed this example, and my own feeling about the LA stations is they didn't spend very much money on them, and I think they're kind of disappointing, but who knows? So maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. These were the challenges that we put together in our study that we felt from across the case studies, talking to people that people had really experienced. Some of them I'm going to talk about at greater length. One of them is forging and sustaining partnerships. I'm not going to say more about this now, but I do have a whole talk that I give about this. But I will say that in the Cleveland Square case, the principals in that case told us that they had to spend about a third of their time for a period of 5 years on this Gordon Square Arts District. And that time had to come from their own efforts to raise money from and do the programming for their organizations. So that was a serious commitment. And it's really a marvelous thing that the partnership worked, that they were able to work together so well and communicate to each other what their, they had different needs and goals, and were able to listen to that and work together. And they also were, in a way, competing with themselves, because they were raising money for the streetscape and the theaters, and that came from their own effort to raise the money for their programming and so on and so forth. Countering community skepticism has been a challenge in a lot of places. Assembling adequate financing, I think that's obvious, and I think this case I showed you shows that. Clearing regulatory hurdles, so there are a lot of different, planning, zoning, other kinds of regulations that often make this work difficult. And avoiding displacement and gentrification, I am going to talk about that more a little bit later. And performance and evaluation. These are all some of the challenges. I want to just say what has happened since then in terms of actual funding. These aren't large amounts of money, but they've made a huge difference, I think, in the United States. So the NEA Our Town grants, which began in 2011, altogether they've funded $21 million worth of projects in all 50 states in the District of Columbia. Their projects require at least one public sector partner and one nonprofit partner, and one of them has to be an arts and cultural organization. So it can be the Cultural Affairs Department of a city government with a community development corporation, or it can be a theater group with the Department of Housing or Transportation in the city or something like that. And it has to be real. I remember Joan telling me early on, it can't just be that the mayor signs a little letter and says, yes, I'm really for this. You have to really demonstrate that whatever city organization is involved, they're really, really into it and knowledgeable about it and really committed to it. And the amounts were small, $25,000 to $200,000. And the goal was that these would contribute to the livability of communities and to place arts and culture at their core. This comes right off the NEA website, I'm very happy to say. Rocco Landesman did one other third amazing thing. At the very beginning of his tenure, he went around and knocked on the doors of the presidents of the largest foundations in the United States and asked them, because of his pitiful budget, the guy is a producer, that if they would put up money for an ArtPlace organization, a consortium of foundations that would also fund very similar projects. And they agreed. So 11 major national and regional foundations are part of ArtPlace, 6 of the nation's largest banks willing to finance these projects, 8 federal agencies, including HUD, Health and Human Services, Transportation, and Agriculture, permit funding for some of their different programs to be used in these projects. And altogether, they have funded $57 million worth of projects through early 2014. And some of the foundations, Kresge, for instance, have made this also a priority for their own funding. So very, very interesting partnership. I wanted to address a few of these points that I've raised, and one of them is really about how do you get your mayor and city council and other political leaders to sign on? And this is really based partly on a talk I gave at the Kauffman Foundation to mayors from around the United States last year actually. And these are some ideas. So this first idea comes actually from our amazing, head of Minnesota, what do we call it? Citizens for the Arts. And she said the best way to get your legislators to support, more spending for arts and culture is to invite them personally to come with you to an arts event. And not just to come, but to go with you. And I always recommend theater, but you have to just be careful what the theater piece is. Make sure it's good first. And that experience of going to something that's really exciting and powerful, it really can make a huge difference to somebody who's never really been exposed to that before. And another is to bring a group of arts participants and art lovers to a city council meeting and give a really upbeat, talk to the city council about, what arts means to them and they're part of the city or whatever. Another is to elect through a coalition an arts-friendly, mayor or city council member. This was done most brilliantly in Seattle, where in the 1990s the police were harassing live music venues and groups like Nirvana, for noise levels, et cetera. And so a group of musicians formed this organization to try to elect a music-friendly mayor. And by 2002 they did, in this fellow Greg Nichols. And he started a whole Seattle City of Music program, which is fabulous. And I won't say more about it now, but I could talk about it. And by the way, Bill Byers, who's a professor of geography, did 2 amazing studies of the Seattle music industry that really showed, is the most beautiful graphic in the world that shows the relationship between musicians and their music lovers and consumers and all the different businesses and activities that go on that really feed into that connection, all the different platforms and stages that connect them, which he also documented in Seattle by going out and counting all of them and figuring out how many people worked for them and so on and so forth. And that has survived as an amazing, amazing effort, which now has been embraced by the Chamber of Commerce, which has a program to get every single one of their businesses in Seattle to use Seattle musicians' music in their products, in their marketing. And also SeaTac Airport has a new initiative to have live busking in the airport, which there was a wonderful guy playing a guitar in the Portland airport. When I walked in the other day, I started to talk to him. It was so cool. And also, busking in airports, and you're going to be able to see Seattle musicians on those little terminals in the gate areas only. I'm just a little nervous, like, what kind of music am I going to have to listen to? But anyway, okay. And also, there's also campaigns to raise tax money for the arts. And if anybody's interested in that, I could talk about the Denver Arts District effort, which was an amazing thing. The Minnesota voters voted 8 years ago to raise 0.5% sales tax for basically for hunting, environment, and arts and culture, which they called legacy. And the polling actually is called wildlife, clean water, and legacy. But it's added $50 million for arts and culture to the budget of the State Arts Board for Minnesota, and that's an amazing thing for 25 years, constitutional amendment. So there are ways to really have campaigns for that as well. This evidence, by the way, comes from both my Kaufman case study, which is on the Kaufman and my website, How Cities Can Nurture Cultural Entrepreneurs, and also from this Otis Creative Economy. Every year, Otis funds and Los Angeles Economic Development Commission to do a study of the creative economy in LA, and they invited me twice to write add-ons, and in this one I do this whole piece that includes Seattle City of Music, San Jose's Creative Entrepreneur Project, and Minneapolis St. Paul Artist Centers, which I presented at the Google new YouTube headquarters in LA, and it was really successful, and I used Bill Byers' graphic in it, and people loved that so much, and so I talk about those and that. Okay, how about sustainability and sort of year-round vibrancy? And basically, this comes from work I did when I was on my UK distinguished, visitorship or whatever it was there. And one of them is to avoid putting all your money into big, long-term capital projects, big building projects. And the other is being just careful about, putting all your investment in one-off events, which are festivals or whatever. And these are just two examples of failures in the UK, funded by UK structural funds and by UK lottery funds, European structural funds and UK lottery funds. This one in Sheffield, the National Center for Popular Music, which failed within 15 months because they thought they would have 500,000 visitors. They only had 100,000. And this is the Urbis, which was a kind of joint history and art museum in Manchester. This failed after 7 years and was shuttered for 3 years and is now a football museum, which nobody thinks is really going to succeed either. So there are some, and this is the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, which from the very first day it opened, our major theater critic asked on the front page of our Minneapolis Star Tribune, can they really fill the seats in this theater? And this turned out to be prophetic, and I think was a huge, huge, massive mistake, which I could talk about a lot more, and I have written up in at least 1 or 2 places. So what does work? And what we found in this creative placemaking is really thinking about spaces, dedicated spaces in communities that are really, populated daily and weekly and sometimes overnight, in the case of live-work spaces, that are really embedded in neighborhoods, theaters, artist centers, live and work studio buildings with built-in entrepreneurship. So thinking more in that sense of really, lots of activity going on in your city. And also avoiding cultural districts. So it's been a fad in a lot of places to designate cultural districts. And I have really been opposed to this from the beginning because I think, one, it implies that every other place in the city isn't a cultural district. And actually, Chicago was going to designate, 20 years ago, a theater district downtown. And all the theaters on, in Lincoln Park on the north side said, you mean we're going to make us move downtown so we can put a theater district? And they successfully at least got the city to change it to a downtown theater district. But I really like to think about Jane Jacobs' depiction of New York City in her book, The Great American City in 1960, or The Life and Death of Great American Cities, where she depicted New York City as a series of neighborhoods, Greenwich Village, Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown, all of which had distinctive local cultures and cuisines and activities, but had porous borders where they invited people to cross the borders and come visit in their area. And to me, this idea of a mosaic is a more powerful thing for cities than thinking about, sort of like designating, we're going to put all our resources here in one way or the other. I love this particular picture. By the way, almost all my photographs are begged, borrowed, but not stolen, from arts organizations and people and so on. Most of my publications I have given photo credits where I know who they did it. This is High Point Center for Printmaking, which is an artist center that has an artist cooperative in it, programs for artists who are accomplished artists but have never printed to come work as a master printmaker, and runs programs for school kids. It's a dedicated space run by a membership organization. And I love this picture because it shows the kind of porosity of the building. What's going on inside is a gallery show, and you can see people coming in and out. You can see the wonderful windows, the visibility of the place to the street. And it's embedded in a neighborhood. And I actually did a pro bono consultation for them after the space became too small and they wanted to move. And they were so distressed because they said, we love our neighborhood. We want to stay here, but we can't stay in this building. Where should we go? And we had a really interesting discussion, and they only moved a few blocks away, which was really great. I wanted to finish because I want to have a lot of time to interact with you, so about really addressing, actually I have 2 more topics, and one of them is about the gentrification issue, because this has been a very, very controversial issue among academics on the subject and in real life as well. So in 1982, Sharon Zukin wrote this book about New York City in which she basically argued that artists were kind of urban pioneers, and that their presence and fixing up these old lofts that had been vacated by the apparel industry in the lower part of New York had been a sort of sign for developers to come in, who then came in and displaced the artists and made upscale apartments. And I really think her argument is insufficient. That I actually knew economists who were graduate students at the New School at the time who did exactly the same thing. So first of all, it wasn't just artists that were doing this. There were a lot of young urban pioneers in many cities. Often they were young couples who had 2 incomes and jobs in the city, and they didn't want to live in the suburbs. So there was a lot of this going on that wasn't necessarily artists, even though I think her book is brilliant in really talking about culture and artists, and describing this process. But I don't think it's just about artists. And the other really interesting thing is there are many places where the presence of artists has never caused this process of gentrification. And why is that? Because gentrification only happens in places where there is pressure on land values and housing. And Portland is one of those places right now. New York City, every rich person in the world wants to have an apartment in New York City. So you're always going to have that in New York City. And it's happening all the time. Susan Seifert and Mark Stern, Susan Seifert, planning professor at Penn, did this wonderful study of Philadelphia 10 years ago or so, or a little less, where they showed that the presence of artists and arts organizations in all kinds of different neighborhoods in Philadelphia had a positive effect on security, on diversity, et cetera, without raising property values and without displacing anybody. So and why? Because Philadelphia wasn't a place anybody was moving to, until just very recently, and then now things have changed a little. In my colleague Anne Gadwa Nicodemus, who was my planning student at University of Minnesota, she really worked in her master's thesis on an evaluation of art-based projects buildings, which are live-work buildings and some studio buildings and other buildings across the United States, to look at the impact of these buildings on their neighborhoods. And this is an example. These were 2 of the earliest art-based buildings which were empty warehouses. The one on the right had no roof on it, which were redeveloped into artist live and work housing and have been run by ArtSpace. They continue to own and manage the buildings, so they'll stay affordable and they'll stay dedicated to artists since the early 1990s. And also the Traffic Zone building, which is a building that is just studio space. And here is an ArtSpace building in Portland, Everett Lofts, which I toured the last time I was here, which is almost 10 years ago. So what did she find in her study? She found that she looked at all the different kinds of impact and used the best possible tools there were. She found that artists really thrived in these circumstances, but interestingly, their incomes did not go up. But the amount of time that they spent with their artwork went up a lot because they were able to quit their day jobs or work a lot less at day jobs because they had better access to other artists, to space. There are performance spaces and visual art spaces and places, to keep your artwork and put your chemicals for photography and all those things in these places. So, and what does that mean? It means that they freed up jobs for other people, other crappy jobs, but they did. She also found that they had a very positive impact on the art community as a whole because these buildings run, open, gallery nights a couple times a year. The ones in St. Paul have really enlivened their neighborhood through that and through bringing in people over. Of course, that increases the income for artists as well. She found that the impact in the neighborhood was very positive. The farmers market across the street has been reopened after being shuttered for 30 years. And because it was a neighborhood that already had a lot of empty housing space in it, it had the advantage of really increasing commercial activity in the neighborhood, in the the businesses that were there did a lot better, and also there was more safety on the streets because some artists, like musicians, tend to be moving in and out in evening hours at night, so there were more people on the streets. And she found very little displacement. Property taxes went up for the city and so on. So in general, there were very positive impacts to the work that were done in this case by ArtSpace, building these buildings. Now, I also want to say that there's some very interesting work going on, and I'm very interested to hear about Lisa Bates' work, which you talked about some today. And this piece I really like very much by Rick Jacobus and Karen Chappell, where they looked at San Francisco. They developed a whole nuanced set of definitions of gentrification. And they looked at retail gentrification in areas of San Francisco and Oakland, the East Bay, where there was really, really low-income communities with, a lot of shuttered retail space, and they found that modest levels of retail gentrification were really good for the residents who lived there. They had positive effects on, crime and offered services to people that weren't there before. So I think that we have to get, in the gentrification debate, we have to get beyond, just this sort of thing, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, or whatever, and really have more nuanced ideas about what gentrification can be. Now, there's also some very interesting work, and I'm not an expert in this field, but I have just really spent some time with Liz Mueller, who had been my postdoc at Rutgers and now teaches in planning at University of Texas at Austin. She is doing really, really interesting work in Austin, trying to prevent displacement from low-income renters. And in the Austin transit system that they've been putting in, they have been frequently displacing renters. And there was an instance of this in one neighborhood where there was a big, building of low-income, renters right where they wanted to build the train and put the track. So she did, with her students, a survey of everybody in the building and asked them, what will be the impact on you and where would you like to live? And they all said, we want to live in this neighborhood. Our kids go to school here. We don't really want to be displaced. Then she went and she took it to the city and she took it to the housing authority. And she said, you have a responsibility. You're putting in this, for huge amounts of money, this transit system. You have a responsibility to figure out how to rehouse these people in the neighborhood. And they found a building just a couple of blocks away that would take a lot of the people from this building and work them in there. So she's working, it's not a done deal yet, but she's really working towards an arrangement where the city will take responsibility for the displacement of low-income renters and will still have the transit station at the same time, which I think is quite wonderful. And I think in general, when we're thinking about gentrification, I always say, well, we live in a system of capitalist land ownership where people are permitted to do with their property what they want to, given whatever the laws are, and the zoning regulations and everything else. And we kind of have to live with that. We can try to change it. There are all these interesting innovations like land banking, et cetera, or like ArtSpace saying we're going to be a nonprofit and we're going to continue to own and operate these buildings so they will stay affordable and stay dedicated to artists. So I think this is a really important thing to try to really understand the complexity in these situations where we're trying to avoid displacement. I really recommend this amazing dissertation, the last one I probably will ever serve on in my life. Carolyn Sarmiento finished in planning at UC Irvine and is now a professor at University of Wisconsin. And she was a part of building a center for really recent immigrants from Veracruz, Mexico, very poor and many undocumented people coming into Santa Ana, California, which is a huge suburb in Orange County, which has an all-Latino city council. The all-Latino city council was very busy gentrifying their downtown. They made a deal with San Francisco or Cal State Fullerton to build a building for art students that would have studios and displaced a bunch of Latino merchants who were serving the low-income community. And they have had 6 different rented spaces for their El Centro Cultural, which teaches dance and musical instruments and works with people in Veracruz to create instruments and costumes, which they then sell to help send money back to Veracruz, and works intergenerationally with grandparents who are knitting down to teenagers who are doing hip hop, all supporting each other. And they have really used their arts and culture as a form of political protest. And they have done parades and protests. They go and testify before city council all the time. They try to work with their city council. And it's an amazing saga, very sophisticated account of this kind of struggle and the way that often low-income people's cultural activities are dismissed in a sort of, kind of formulaic thing about how to gentrify a place, and it's a story that's not really over as well. I finally wanted to say just a few words about evaluation. I could talk about this quite long, but I have written, a piece on it. But I'll just say that one of the things that, the most shocking thing to me about our creative placemaking effort was that we had this kind of throwaway line in our creative placemaking study, which said, there should be metrics for evaluating performance. And before I knew it, both the NEA and ArtPlace were commissioning these indicators or doing it in-house, which would use secondary data, and they would then send this out to communities, and these indicators were supposed to tell you, both how you compared to other places and whether or not your creative placing is succeeding. So I'm speaking around the country, and one day I'm on a panel with a woman who was leading a long time, really interesting organization in San Francisco, and another one who's doing the same in Minneapolis and St. Paul, both in lower income neighborhoods. And they're going, what is this? What is this stuff? An indicator like home ownership? Like the neighborhood I'm in, there's not that much home ownership. And anyway, young people, they don't own homes till they're in their 30s. And low-income people, they don't really own homes. And why would home ownership be an important, indicator or sign of increased vitality or vibrancy or something else? So really, really critical, and they were just freaked out. So I started looking carefully at what these indicators were, and I really, realized that there were huge problems with them. And some of the problems were really just even definitional. What are the goals of these creative making projects? What is quality of life? One person's quality of life, think about live music. That's a big quality of life thing for a lot of young people, but for people living in the neighborhood, a lot of loud, raucous music at night is not quality of life. So just really thinking about defining it is hard. And also, one of the things that I wrote in this rant, which I'll show you in a minute, was that there was really very little about intrinsic art outcomes. And I'm going to take a little detour here and say that one of the results of the culture wars was that the arts community retreated back to these economic arguments about the arts. So, and even my first piece, The Artistic Dividend, which I wrote with one of my students, and which was a spec piece in which I detailed all the ways that artists really contribute to local economic development, which I won't go into right now, was very much economistic. I'm an economist, that's how I started. And of course, Americans for the Arts every year, chunks out these studies that show how the arts contributes to economic prosperity. And I have these arguments all the time with our leading arts advocate. When she goes to the legislature, she's always saying, every dollar you spend on an artist is respent in the local community, and this is how much it adds up to. And I go like, do scientists, engineers, and doctors have to go to the legislature and say every dollar you spend on us is going to be respent locally? No, because they go and say, we're engineers, we're bringing you infrastructure, you got to fund infrastructure. We're doctors, we're bringing you health care, you got to fund us, and so on and so forth. So this, I think, is a very weak argument, because actually anything you spend money on will have an economic impact, and it won't be that different. I really feel that it's important to understand how this economic turn was a retreat. It was a retreat given the culture wars, and there are several wonderful pieces written. John Kalaki, who's the one who really taught me about this, has written this beautiful piece. He was at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis when this stuff all happened, and then at the Yerba Buena Center, and now he's running the Flynn Theater in Burlington, Vermont. I've written about it, and this amazing young professor at University of Texas, Austin, has just written a book, which will be out soon, in which he also really documents the history of these culture wars and what happened. But I want to just say that there are these really important intrinsic contributions to the art. Beauty, this is Sherwood Chen, who's a Taiwanese American. He's brought a form of modern Buto dance from Japan to the Bay Area. This is Marcus Shelby, an amazing musician who I met a jazz professor today. There he is right there, who knows Marcus. So this is his combo. He has a big band. And Delight, Jeff Rez, a circus musician, Valina Brown at the ACT Theater and Mime Troupe in San Francisco. Humor, I wish I'd bought this print when it was first shown at the High Point Center for Minneapolis. Dave Rathman did a whole series on cowboys, and this one said, "My vices were magnificent." Oh, I wish I'd bought this piece. It's so great. Garrison Keillor, who travels around the country doing a humor show and actually brings a lot of money back into Minnesota and is in the nonprofit sector, by the way. He works for Minnesota Public Radio. Innovation, this is the San Jose Art and Technology Biennial that happens every 2 years. These are artist renditions of what cars, environmentally friendly cars of the future might look like. There's a whole art car parade. Challenge, this is Paul Bonin Rodriguez, in his performance pieces that he does on his Latino Catholic background and the struggles as a gay man that he has with that culture. And the book is wonderful about that as well. Political and social critique and protest. Keith Knight, a Bay Area cartoonist who's done these amazing series. This one is The iPod Assembly Line. This is a group, Hanuri, of Korean American young people who have brought Korean music and dance, and in this case to a protest march they're doing in LA around immigrant rights. Mirrors on Our Self and Society. This is Elizabeth Partridge, a Berkeley-based writer who writes these books for teenagers on John Lennon and other important people from the last 50 years that she feels young people should know about. Seth Gordon, LA filmmaker, a wonderful documentary of a rock and roll star and what happened to him the rest of his life, New York Doll. Remembering Our History, Jim Demi's amazing, huge canvases in oil of Native American and white encounters that are satires and spoof at the same time they reveal an awful lot. This is in our Science Museum in Minnesota. Carol Charney, a Bay Area artist who works by day as the art director at an advertising agency and is a fine art photographer. These are her remembrance of the Holocaust series that she does. And here's Marcus Shelby again with his trio. And among other things, he's written a series of oratorios. This was his first, Port Chicago, which is about which I never even knew about, the largest 48 state disaster in World War II where 200-some American sailors who were all African-American were killed in an ammunition explosion. And when the rest of the sailors went out on protest of their working conditions, they were all given dishonorable discharges from the American Navy. This oratorio, which he performed with his jazz big band around the Bay Area, resulted in those few African-American men who were left becoming reinstated in the US Navy and getting all of their back benefits. An amazing, really, thing. Understanding diverse cultures, bridging between them and bonding. This is Hirako Kosaka, who is the artistic director at the Japanese American Cultural Center in LA, doing a performance. He also designed the Little Tokyo light rail station. And I love this group so much, although I think they don't exist anymore, but this is a Filipina lesbian group who did these performances. This woman here is a drag king. She's also an amazing visual artist, because they were trying to deal with their lesbianism in their Filipino culture. And they were using drama as a way to try to express to their families and their community, what their lives were really all about. And there are some very, very interesting efforts to really begin to measure the intrinsic value of the arts and to make the case for them. This amazing piece, Gifts of the Muse by the RAND Corporation, reframing the debate about Venezuela way before its time, 2004. And by the way, most of these photos come from my crossover study of LA and Bay Area artists. And Alan Brown and Jennifer Novak have actually started doing surveys of people coming out of theater performances. And they're asking them, what was the emotional impact? What was your intellectual experience, and so on and so forth. And imagine being asked that instead of, as Bill Byers has been doing for years, asking you how much money you spent on a restaurant meal and how much money you spent on a hotel when you came, to the theater performance, which theaters used to hand out these things asking you things. They don't do anymore. So I'm not going to really talk about this more because it's 5 to 7, and I'd really like to spend the next 20 minutes talking to you. But I did do this rant when I saw this vibrancy and vitality indicators coming out from the NEA, and just promising groups that they were going to send them these canned indicators and data so they could compare themselves with other places and so on. This is an NEA quote. So I wrote this rant, and it was called Fuzzy Concepts Proxy, Why Creative Placemaking Indicators Won't Track Creative Placemaking Success. And I decided to run it as a blog because I wanted to influence policy, and I wanted to influence fast, because I was hearing all of these distress calls from around the US. And Ian David Moss, who ran it on his blog, found this wonderful graphic. I made the sign but had nothing to say. And underneath it, it said, "But there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept," a quote from Ansel Adams. And I'm going to just skip all these things, but in it, it's really a great critique, a great social science critique of the use of these indicators. And you know, what I offer is what I think is a better path to evaluate the projects that you fund on the basis of what they said they wanted to do in the beginning, and which is what foundations have been doing for years. And providing technical assistance to your grantees to make them better, and convening your grantees to help them learn from each other. And I'm very proud to say that this piece, not only did it go viral when it first came out, but it was picked up by grant makers from the Arts Reader and also published in International Urban Sciences Journal. So it's gotten really great airing. And the upshot is that ArtPlace is not using these indicators as evaluation. That was emphatically said to me in the last few weeks by the current executive director. And the Urban Institute commissioned, or NEA commissioned the Urban Institute to do a study of these indicators. And basically they came back and they said most of these indicators are inappropriate for either conceptual or operational reasons, although some reflect desirable community characteristics. But, you know, and they also did interviews of people across the country who were doing creative placemaking. There was great skepticism that the change in these indicators could be used to gauge creative placemaking interventions. And there's a citation for that study. So that's it. I'd love to hear from you, and please feel free to talk back, to disagree with me, to raise any, you know, concerns that you have. And thank you. And do we have a mic, or can people just?
There's a Q&A mic right on the right
okay.
side there if anyone wants.
Great, but you can just stand up and project.
Arts, they should know.
Oh, they aren't all in performing arts. Are you? Yes, project. Yeah.
I guess I'd just be curious.
Could you stand up and introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Kevin. I am just curious. I would I'd like to know your thoughts. I think a lot of times people connect placemaking with historic preservation, or tangentially connect those two, whether it be a mural on the side of an old building, what have you. And I think a lot of times where we think about the challenge could be is in the suburbs or in completely new districts that are being built in a city. I think in a place like Portland or other places like New York or San Francisco, we're starting to see vulnerable populations or people of color moving much farther out from the central city. And so I was wondering if you had any examples, or were wondering how you could bring placemaking to a more suburban environment.
Yes, well, thank you for asking. That's great. First of all, in our study, we have a case study of the Phoenix area infrastructure project where they were putting in huge money into infrastructure, and they decided to have an artist consultation committee and to use some of this infrastructure as space. All of Phoenix is a suburb, as far as I'm concerned, to really for convening and for experience of walking and beauty and so on. So there's one case study. I do think that there are some suburbs around the country. We had a huge flap in the Twin Cities when our major, our biggest of three great foundations, actually, the McKnight Foundation, decided to fund 2 studies on art in the suburbs. And the organizations in the city got freaked out and said, oh no, you're not gonna fund us, you're gonna send the money to the suburbs. But one amazing case is that, this little inner ring suburb that dated from World War II, that was actually mostly Jewish, low and moderate income people. And by the 1990s, it was like really down at the heels. There were pawn shops, a lot of people had moved out, and the remaining aging people wanted to stay in the community. So the city council decided to build their own little right-sized performing and visual arts center. And this has had an amazing effect on the community because, almost immediately restaurants started opening across the street, a third-run art cinema opened up, and developers started to build income for, mainly senior housing, but kind of medium-rise housing, and it's completely changed this little town. And it's run and operated by the city of Hopkins, it's called. So there's an example there. So I think now, I will say it's mostly the more prosperous suburbs that are beginning to develop. So we should really encourage that. And also I'd like to say that, churches are cultural spaces, and many churches employ 1/3 of all American musicians, people who either make their first or second income work for religious organizations. Think about that. And we, in the arts community, we never talk about religious organizations as arts and cultural space, but they are. And many of them also employ visual artists. So there are a lot of spaces like that that are in in the LA area. There are huge Chinese churches, and they are the cultural centers for their community. And the same thing goes for Latino churches and a lot of other places. So we have to really change our, broaden our sense really of what that's all about. So I think that's part of it. It is really true. My data show that the suburbs have very low representation of artists as residents. That even, greater Minnesota has more artists per capita than the suburbs of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So artists are very much, oriented towards living in the more central parts of the metro area, and especially performing artists, and less so visual artists and writers who are more tend to work alone. But I think it's a really important point. And actually, part of the most exciting thing is what's happening in really small towns. And we have a couple of cases, one a Native American reservation, one Arnoldville, Louisiana. In my Arts Center study, we have this amazing case of New York Mills, which built a regional cultural center, a little town, took a little old storefront given to them by the guy because it was empty, and convinced the city council that people would actually come if they make a, regional cultural center. It was just aimed at people in the area. They weren't going to try to attract tourists or anything, and it's been very successful. So I really appreciate that question. We have to kind of get beyond our blinders about, that idea that we think about, just like cities and art is sort of a thing and nothing else is out there anywhere else. Yeah.
Bob needs things and work with TriMet on the Interstate Max
Yeah.
project in the art program. Is intriguing to me what you're saying about the folks coming together in their own place, but rather than sort of reinforcing their close community, actually using it to open into new experiences. Could you maybe elaborate on that or take more of that?
I could. Well, I really do believe that this distinctiveness idea is very important, and you have to start with your own culture first. That's what this guy did in New York Mills. Actually, the guy was an artist. He moved to this community because he could get a big old farmhouse. He had gallery representation, and and then he got a little bored. He got our foundation in Minneapolis to send him a little money for an artist in residency, and then he went to the city council and he said, your downtown is a mess, it's dying. You've got these beautiful 19th century buildings. How about if we made one a regional cultural center? And the city council said, who would come? And he said, oh, who would come? And he spent the next year going around and knocking on doors and finding farmers who had pretty good landscape paintings in the back of their barns that they painted, and people who were in choral groups and had their own even little music combos. And the next year he went back with a lot of people, and he really made this argument. And they really started. They were a sort of Finnish farming community. They started with their own, and they have some Native Americans because they're right next to a reservation. So they started with their own local culture, but also sort of welcomed other people to come. I drove in it, I had never seen the place because Amanda Johnson, one of my other wonderful students, who's now a professor at Boise State, did that particular case study. And I drove in there one November with my husband. I said, oh, let's stop. I want to see this place. I walk in and there's this amazing jazz pouring down from upstairs. The visiting artist is this woman who's an Israeli jazz pianist based in New York. She's the visiting artist for a month. And every visiting artist has to do something in the community. And I went up and spent an hour with her. She said, I'm giving a jazz improv workshop here tomorrow night. You want to come? I said, I live 3 hours east of here. Otherwise, I would definitely come. So I think that's the idea, that you want to start with something distinctive, but you also want to be open. When I moved back to the Twin Cities, my brother and sister-in-law, who have 5 kids, said to me, we go out every Wednesday night for our, date night. I said, where do you go? Oh, we go to a different neighborhood every week. Like, last week we went to the Lynn Lake District, we went to the Jungle Theater, before that we went to the Greek restaurant, and afterwards we went to the Tapas Bar. And then I realized this was the mosaic, that there were these neighborhoods, they had this distinctive little nodes of cultural activity, and that they loved this idea of going into these different neighborhoods every week and joining in on what had, sort of spontaneously grown up in this neighborhood. That's what Stern and Seifert call these natural cultural districts. So I think that's the really beautiful thing. Most, like these El Centro Cultural in Santa Ana, they're really open to other people come. They'll teach dance forms to anyone. I just interviewed a guy who's a Native American artist in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, where I'm doing a project with other people to do a cultural plan, and he wants to teach moccasin making. And I said to him, would you be willing to teach anyone? Yes, he said, I would be willing to teach anyone. It's not just for my people, you know. I'd be really happy to teach anyone how to do this. So I really thank you for that question, and I think that's kind of the way we need to think about this. And also, I just visited, John Kalacki's, Flynn Center in Burlington, and their programming is mind-blowing. They're bringing in all kinds of amazing things from outside the community, but they also have all these spaces for local dance and local art exhibits. They're getting beyond this idea that there's somehow like fine arts and then everything else. And they're really going with this idea that, the more that people participate in making art themselves, the LA Active Arts Program started this thing around all of LA to get people to pick up their high school instrument and play it with other people. And they got a whole group formed called Highfalutin. They're all flute players. And now they play at weddings, they play at cafes. And just this idea, like, you don't have to be the greatest in the world. And if you, get reconnected with these things, you're going to be more apt to go hear and listen to and patronize and buy the work and music of people who are really outstanding. That's the idea. Yes.
Great talk, and I'm just gonna talk loud. I think I can
Stand up, though.
I think I can.
Introduce yourself.
Jason Jerkovich,
Yeah.
PSU. So one of the things I learned when I was living in Charlotte was there was a close relationship with private enterprise and businesses, particularly banks living in Charlotte. So Wachovia before it got bought up by Wells Fargo and Bank of America. And the narrative was particularly around two incidents that happened in the late 90s to early 2000s, where the local theater company brought in one particular focus on HIV/AIDS crisis among the gay community in San Francisco in the early 80s to mid-80s. And then there was a later show that focused on the gentrification and displacement of people of color, particularly focusing on Charlotte in the redevelopment of Uptown area. And there was a number of conservative individuals and organizations that opposed the city funding these two activities, these two groups coming to Charlotte. And who ended up stepping up at the end once the city pulled the funding was Bank of America.
Wow.
And Hugh McCall.
First good thing I've
what was interesting about it was Hugh McCall was CFO at the time and was a very conservative person from rural South Carolina. And his comment was about both the AIDS show as well as the displacement under gentrification was that recognizing that a productive business and productive capitalism, recognizing the benefits of the arts to individuals who were working and living in Charlotte. And they developed a really close relationship between the arts community and private enterprise in Charlotte after that. But my question is, to what extent have you seen that play out in other cities across the country?
Yeah, that's really a great question, and that's a great example. And I actually never been to Charlotte, so I've been close there, so I'd love to see it sometime. I think it's really beginning to happen. Actually, I just finished a piece with Anne for the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco has a community development journal, and they are doing a whole issue on creative placemaking, and it's aimed at community bankers. So just bankers in communities, but also, actual community bankers, anybody that funds, activity at a local level. And I think it'll be a very effective thing. We're going to have a press conference in San Francisco in the middle of January, and I'm very hopeful that it will really, because often a lot of these creative placements, they've had a hard time with banks, with local banks. They don't really necessarily get it or anything like that. So I think that's a great role model. Maybe I should get you to write that up for this journal, although I think it's pretty much in process. But I hope somebody really does write about that, because I haven't seen too many examples. There are some cases, like in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, they have a bank where the people who own the bank are amazing patrons of the arts. They have artwork hanging in their bank. They do an art fair with their artwork and invite other artists to participate every year. That's a community event. So, and that's just another really interesting part of this. Some hospitals, this Native American reservation near me, the guy who runs it and has 5 buildings that are in a social service complex, from the very beginning, as soon as they got the casino money in 1989, convinced the tribal council that every building should have Native American art by contemporary Native American artists, and because art is part of healing. And he said it's had, and not only did we write it up in our creative placemaking, but I rewrote it up recently for some other thing I wrote, I forget where. And so I re-interviewed him again, and he's not only that, it's really important for our staff because they deal with a lot of dysfunction. So every room has beautiful work. Some of it's very traditional beadwork, but done by contemporary artists. Some of it's far out, amazing, you know, kind of new, vibrant, young versions of Native American work. And he's generating a lot of income for artists. So it's just amazing. The same thing, doing a lot of murals inside the buildings and, you know, everything else. So there's this also beginning. I really feel like the arts is coming back into its own in this country thanks to, you know, 1,000 lights or whatever you want to call it. But people doing things like this in all kinds of different places and really beginning to make those openings. So, yes.
Yes, Ashley Ferry. There's a
Do you want mine?
there's a real movement in this country that's sort of the guilt factor. Last night at the San Francisco Opera, Chevron presented they want to make themselves look good, and you're seeing that even Exxon Mobil, notoriously, and even David Koch, who put it in all of the new fountains in front of the Met and redid the New York State Theater, and had, of course, named after himself afterwards. But nonetheless, all these companies, even Williams and all the Halliburtons, they're very interested in this, and I think we need to focus on that as people begging for arts, and keep them in mind, because they want to legitimize themselves, and that's really important. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other? Some?
Yep.
Ethan,
Yeah, right.
just stand up and project. Introduce yourself.
Right. Ethan Seltzer. All right. You know, I was really struck by the finding that there was an individual champion. And, you know, because I mean, so much of the community work that we do is about collaboration, it's about partnerships, about the notion that, you know, it's not one person, it's kind of the way in which many people kind of join together. But yet, it sounds like in the case studies you did, one of the things that really stood out was that, particularly with the arts, there was like a champion. And are you seeing that, you know, is that being sustained? Is that kind of the way it is?
That's a good thing, question. I do want to say that, you know, the musician that I showed, actually the organizations that I interviewed, they never told me about him. And after I published the study, somebody wrote to me, a woman wrote to me, said, I cannot believe that you did not give this guy credit for what he did. Yeah. So I was appalled. And also in our Paducah, Kentucky case study, which was about how they, you know, took these buildings and offered them to artists, and artists came. So we interviewed the artists, we interviewed, you know, the mayor and other people. So afterwards, the guy who had been the head city planner wrote to me and he said, and now he was the head city planner in Cleveland, now he's in Baltimore. And he wrote to me and said, you know, I can't believe I didn't get any credit for these. He said, I did all the work. And he detailed all the things he did. So in this Federal Reserve piece I've written, I give him a whole paragraph and I detail what he did because it's so unfair. You know, so that is an issue. And when I give this talk about partnering, I really talk about you have to, one, listen to what your other partners, you know, what their priorities are. You have to really, I learned this years ago when the environmentalists and the labor movement were trying to team up, and the environmentalists would go to the labor people and they'd say, join us, you know, join the fight for environment, which was hard for the unions, and the unions say, okay, join us, fight for, you know, better rules for unions and wages, and the environmentalists go, what? You know? So, but the other thing is really just exactly this thing, giving people credit. So I was just, you know, I was really furious, and in both cases I went back to the principals and I said, you know, why? And when they opened these theaters in Cleveland Square, and the guy was there, they didn't even give him credit. They didn't even bring him up to the front or anything. You know, so that's kind of unforgivable. I would say that now that there's funding and it's becoming a broader thing, it's more the case, and because the funding has to go to organizations, you know, you're seeing more organizations, but I think even there, it's often, you know, one person in the organization that comes forward. And there still are cases where it is really one person, right. Especially in smaller places, but not necessarily the Cleveland things, you know, it's one person. In the Philadelphia Mural Arts was one woman, Jane Golden, an artist. She went to the mayor and she said, you have all these buildings, you have all these youth in trouble, you've got all these people in prison. You know, how about if we create this mural arts program? This was like 30 years ago. And you know, we'll train, we'll make it a job training program for youth and for people, first-time offenders. And we'll get the public safety people involved and the workforce development people involved. And we'll decorate all these, you know, beautiful walls all over the city. And we'll decorate all the garbage trucks. I have a beautiful picture of the garbage trucks. It was so beautiful. And that has been in place for 30 years through all the mayors. One woman, Jane Golden, really made that work. So there are just a whole lot of cases like that, which is really pretty exciting. Look what Marcus Shelby did, you know, with his work. Well, 3 people here. Why don't you each get up and say what you'd like to say so that, you know, we can hear what you have to say and I won't say anything. So could you bring the mic over here? These 2 people and then the fellow behind. Okay.
Hi, I'm Steve Bennett. So at the beginning of your talk, you showed us a slide of the Gordon Street project that showed all of the different places where he had gone to get money.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that each one of those places was interested in the economic impact that that project was going to have. And maybe that's part of, as we ended the talk, of this idea of the rhetoric of economic development and its relationship to these centers for the arts. So what I'm wondering is if you can address how planners and elected officials and people who are making decisions about how to spend money about places can be responsible to those budgets and also be supportive of the arts, but also change the discussion about why the arts are valuable.
Right. Right. Well, I'll tell you really quick thing because I want to hear what these 2 women have to ask and say, or, you know, complain about or whatever. So actually, the one thing about Gordon Square is it hasn't really brought that much commercial revitalization. And that's something that several people have come up to me and said, you know, I went there and really, so it's interesting, it hasn't really caused that, but it's created, you know, this artistic activity in the community that people love. So, and I think it is an interesting question, why hasn't it really resulted in commercial revitalization more than it has? So, but it seems to be that everybody's really happy about what is happening there, and that's part of the thing about getting away from just having, you know, economic impacts be, you know, a dominant expectation. But it's a really good question. Okay.
So I'm Marisa. I'm in Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning, and I have a somewhat related question. But really thinking about community and how to justify and convince community members to support the arts. And in my work in Cincinnati, one of the things that's come out is Cincinnati has been historically very supportive of the arts in a wide range. Happy to give money, tax dollars to make that happen. But in the last year, there's been a fierce debate over whether and who should pay for the restorations to Music Hall, which is where the symphony and the opera perform, and then the big museum, the museum where basic arts museum, but also the family museum, natural history museum. And people have said they don't want to pay for Music Hall, which is considered the more historically significant building because it's not seen as a place for everyone. And so it's been a direct pushback against fine arts. People have now voted to fund the restoration of the Natural History Museum building, but they won't fund the Music Hall.
Yeah. Well, this is a really big topic. I'll just say a few things really quickly. I've written a piece with Alan Brown, who's really probably the best consultant in the U.S. based in San Francisco, and has been doing these studies of participation. And in a powerful piece he wrote for Grant Makers and Art Reader, he says that audiences are changing, that people are more restive. They don't want to be sitting in a space, especially in a place that makes them feel uncomfortable or dumb or stupid because they clap in the middle of a performance when they shouldn't, and where other people around them aren't like them. They want to be more actively engaged. They want to participate more. They even want to co-curate, which is very challenging to people in the art community. So that's just the way where we are. And I think that, you know, I mean, the last few years, you know, the American League of Orchestras, I spoke at their annual meeting a couple years ago, you know, their rubric is always change or die. They need to change more. They can't just go out with their hand out, especially when their concert halls aren't full. So I think it's a reasonable thing for the public to say, and some of them are changing. Some of them are taking the performance outdoor. Merce Clingan came to Minnesota and did one of his last performances in a gravel pit in St. Cloud, Minnesota. In a gravel pit. Gazillions of people came. You know? So and you know, in Miami, the symphony orchestra has gone out of doors outside of their concert hall, and And I have wonderful people who do the same thing in Newcastle, where they're a huge new music center. They do the same thing. They don't do their jazz in the concert hall. They do it in the atrium, where people can drink and hang over the balconies and move up and down and move to the music. And they do rock and roll out of doors on the plaza along the river in the summer. So they have to change. I mean, and I think it's completely legitimate for people to say, yes, this still could be a very important part of our whole experience of music, but it has to change. And what Dudamel is doing at the LA Philharmonic is amazing. If you've ever seen the tape of his first performance, which was even before he became, the artistic director, he brought the Youth Orchestra of Venezuela, and they're sitting there, they're spinning their basses around, and pretty soon the whole audience, just like they do in Latin America, is getting up and in the aisles and they're moving. And the critic of the LA Times said this was the greatest show on earth. The first half was impeccable Beethoven, Mozart, and the second half was all Latin music. And it was just wild. So those are the kinds of changes that are happening. And people don't want to pay a huge amount of money. This Guthrie Theater, the state of Minnesota gave them $50 million. The city of Minneapolis built them a parking garage that failed within 2 years, and they had to sell it at a huge loss. And why? And they built a crappy park that they gave the land away. It's right on the Mississippi River. It doesn't relate to the river. Everything about it is so totalizing and bad. I hate to go in there. It's even got this thing where you go up this huge escalator, you don't know where you are in the building, and these different stages are somewhere. It's just horrible. So people, and we want people to be active, participants in arts and culture, and be uppity and cheeky. Instead of, being passive and thinking they're supposed to file in there and sit in the seat and do their thing. Even the Metropolitan Opera opened up the back door finally again to the neighborhood that was the neighborhood of West Side Story. And they built a fortress. Lincoln Center was a fortress, a huge mistake. And so finally they realized we have to open up the neighborhood, so they broke through their back wall. I haven't actually been there to see this yet, but I'm really interested in going. So thank you for that. Lisa. You have something you want to say?
Naomi.
Sorry, thanks.
Last question.
Someday.
Yeah. Stand up, please.
Hi, do I need this? A big voice. I'm Naomi Adib from the Children's School. I'm going to sit down again. I still have a big voice.
That's called curating, that's fine.
So you bring up the culture wars. First, I want to thank you for saying the things that have been making my hair catch on fire for many, many years, and not being able to find language for arts should do more than just generate dollars at restaurants. So thank you. But I wonder, I have sort of a tough question, which is in this creative, the NEA was cut because of bad behavior on the part of artists, right? Andre Serrano's Piss Christ and S&M photos and all sorts of things the American public found
I take umbrage with that. That's not bad behavior. That's their expression.
Right, but it was considered that's how it was painted.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you for
Yeah, no, I think it's great behavior. But by putting artists in the role of creative placemakers, does it mean that they have to behave themselves all over again? And is this setting up a really fragile protocol in which if artists do edgy things, that they're not participating in creative placemaking that's open to everybody anymore because some people will feel scared or outside or intimidated?
Well, this is why art is dangerous. And this is why art retreated, when it was attacked by the Congress, it retreated behind the economic thing, because this is part of the role of arts, is to be cheeky and to speak up. And, I just came back from Prague, and I just, went to this museum of communism, and I wept, looking at what Václav Havel and these other amazing artists had done in leading this democratic revolution. It was just so powerful. So, I don't think we have to, you put it as if the artists were all walking in one step, and they aren't that way. So, there are millions of artists in the United States, and some of them will play the roles of doing that protest, et cetera, and some of them will play other roles. And I don't think that, we can ever squeeze them into it. And part of what we do is entrust them to be creative, et cetera. Some of them will be creative placemakers, and others will continue to do this really mind-blowing work. And we want to create space for all of that. So I don't really see it as a duality, but I'm glad you raised it, because I really think this is the conundrum. This is what John Kalaki came to my study group that I ran
in the Twin Cities, which was not for attribution, was full of arts leaders and artists and really all the kinds of people who would be willing to really speak out. And it was the most electric session we had, because he explained why, when he was a curator of the Art Center, Walker Art Center, and Ron Anthony supposedly threw tainted blood on the audience, that it actually, he did not throw tainted blood, but our major, art critic for our paper wrote that he did, even though she had not even been at the thing, even though it was demonstrated, and she would never retract it. And then he explained to everybody, this was about the AIDS crisis. You have to understand this. And people in the room were saying, like, all the arts people were going like, you are our worst enemy. And he's going, you don't understand. And by the end of the thing, the emotion in the room was so powerful. And various people were going like, I get it. I now finally get it. I understand. And this was like 15 years later. People were, it takes a long time to really absorb those messages and understand them. So thank you for raising that question.
If you have to go, you have to go, but I just wanted to say I'm Daryl Grant, I teach in the music department, and I think that your question is really apropos, because I feel like what you said, that all artists are not placemakers, but I feel like when we invest in the artists who are placemakers, my feeling is that they are the artists who are accountable to place. There are lots of artists who are not. There are lots of artists who prefer to do their work in, not a vacuum, but in a, sort of in an absolutist state, answering only to the art. But I would not say that those are the artists that the community will invest in as placemakers. But there are artists who believe that they're here, they're born here, they're living here. They are happy to present their work in the community, knowing that they answer to that community and that their work is created specifically to move that community forward. If it's controversial, that's fine, because they're not leaving. They're happy to be there to explain, to take the heat. And I feel like that's, to me, that's what we need to create if we're looking at placemakers. For me as an educator, I want to recast the conversation with our artists. You are not, maybe you don't need to be a national artist. Maybe you don't need to be an artist who aspires to move to New York. Maybe we can make it a wonderful, glorious thing to say, I'm here not to create excellent work. I don't believe in that dichotomy, that there are artists who are going to create mind-blowing work and there are artists who are going to be placemakers. But create your art within the context of a community. Make it mind-blowing, but make it mind-blowing as a member of the community, not as somebody who sits outside as some genius who's supposed to be paid just for your work, but as somebody who's, happy to herd the goats if necessary. That's how, you know what I mean? Like, be an artist in that way. And those artists, I feel, are the ones that are really going to have an impact on place.
Thank you. That's a great.
Can I ask you, I'll done in one more round of applause.
Yeah.
I'm going to say this. It's so engaging and so important. I want to say thank you, Anne, if I can say that. So thank you very much. Art would like to have a moment if our sponsor tonight would like to say a few words. We'd love to have Brian Meyer.
Thank you all for coming tonight. The whole purpose of the Equity Forum is to bring provoking speakers to the students and ask you to think a little bit more of something that will challenge you, make you think outside the box. And I hope that did that tonight, made you think of other things. Because the urban planners and artists work together. No revolution has succeeded without the artists. The performing artists, the graphic artists, the plays, the songs, they all help bring about change. And I'd like to introduce Tabitha, who's sitting in the back, who is one of the scholarship recipients today. I want you to notice her because the Bonner family's challenge to her today was, you are going to change our world. Every one of you is an initiator in some way. Your challenge now is to spend your time at school learning the history of your craft, learning the techniques of your craft, learning the rules, and then when you graduate, I expect you to break those rules. The revolution starts with you. Thank you.
Thank thank you all for coming. Enjoy some refreshments and come back next year. Thank you.
I don't want to